Okay, guys. So just want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So first, just want to thank everybody for making it this evening. We really appreciate you guys obviously registering for the event and just making the time to be here with us. We're pretty excited to share some thoughts and insights around how to best support your son in his return home for the holidays and just for the next few months. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to sort of summarize a few of the questions that we've received from you guys. We want to take some time to make sure that we answer those. I know that in the email that went out, there was a space for you guys to be able to ask questions, and want to make sure that we're able to just get back to those. But in addition, we just want to be able to offer some more general thoughts and responses around helping young men and providing some strategies and insights for supporting young men and building independence. We're also going to hopefully at the end of tonight, time permitting, have some space to do a live Q&A. So I would just ask that everybody hold their questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll open the forum up. You can use the hand raise feature again in Zoom, and I'll be able to unmute you, and then you can ask your question. So just to start, guys, I want to introduce our panel speakers. We have Andy Marcoccia. He's a licensed clinical psychologist. He's the director of our intake team here at Causeway. He's been with us for about 4 years. We also have David Gofman. He is a licensed professional counselor. He's the director of training and development at Causeway. He's a Westport native, has been a member of the Causeway team for about 4.5 years. He also completed his master's degree in sports and performance psychology at the University of Denver, and is also currently working towards his teaching training certification in mindfulness-based and stress reduction through the Brown Center for Mindfulness. We also have Justin Carotti, a licensed clinical social worker, has been a part of the team at Causeway for around 6 years. He's the director of our mentorship program. He also offers clinical supervision to our staff. Justin completed his undergraduate at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and also completed his master's at UConn. And then lastly, I'm Nick Fernandes. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. I did my undergrad at Eastern Connecticut State University, where I also played on their lacrosse team. And then in my master's program, I attended the University of Columbia down in New York, and I'm currently pursuing a certification in cognitive behavioral therapy through through NYU. And so we'll be, answering some of you guys' questions this evening, and hope, to have a good discussion and are, hopefully able to answer, a lot of the questions that you guys brought up. So just to start, more broadly, a topic that has come up a lot, is managing competing needs for socialization and safety. Just given the developments of the pandemic recently, with young men arriving home from college or even being at home, in high school, we wanted to offer some more general thoughts around this topic and sort of weighing the balance between those competing needs. And, just want to start off by giving Justin an opportunity to speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and appreciate that introduction and appreciate everyone making the time the Monday of Thanksgiving week here to hop on with us. It's certainly a privilege to be with you guys. So thank you guys for all taking the time. So yeah, not surprisingly, I think it's actually a pretty apropos question for the current circumstances that I think we're all looking ahead to as we think about where we're going to be in Thanksgiving, who we're going to spend time with on Thanksgiving, given the pandemic and the precautions nationally, but also statewide. Certainly restrictions seem to be coming more and more prevalent, I think. So one of the things that I think we've experienced here, not only as an organization, but also with respect to how our guys are interfacing with their communities at large, is the importance of sort of leading from the front. This kind of goes without saying, but I think especially people who are, emerging adults or people who are looking for a direction more generally, even within an organization or any sort of team, look to leaders to sort of lead the way as to, what behaviors are appropriate, and how we should be sort of following in lockstep with whatever the leadership sort of describes and sort of emulates. So I would say from a parent's perspective, if it's important for you, I mean, everyone's a little bit different as to how it is that they're going about. I think understanding the parameters that the state is putting on us and how it is they want to incorporate that within the family system. But if it's important for you to wear masks in social experiences and engagements, then I think it's important to make sure that that's a ubiquitous approach that you and your partner or you guys are using while your kids watch. I think in our experience, especially for the guys that we work with, they're going to look for a little bit of the path of least resistance. So if mom or dad aren't wearing a mask in certain situations, then I don't think it's fair to expect them to be wearing the mask in those same situations. So I guess my first answer to that question, Nick, as I hear it, is just really thinking about like leading from the front with that. Now, that being said, as sort of the preamble leading up to that answer, there's a lot of understanding of the complications and the challenges that are associated with this day and age. I mean, we've been at this thing for quite some time, challenging for all of us personally and professionally, certainly challenging for the guys that we work with and your sons and daughters. So empathizing, I think, is an important sort of therapeutic approach more generally, but just given the circumstances, it's tough. It's just not easy for a person, you know, in that emerging adulthood developmental stage to be having to sort of conform to these authorities and these procedures and some of these precautions. So while it's important to lead from the front, I also think it's important to empathize.
Yeah, Jay, and just to jump off of that for a second, and as you said, you know, thank you everybody for taking the time out of your evening to join us tonight. I think the understanding of the importance of socialization for young adults specifically, and how significant that is just in terms of meeting basic needs for them is really, really critical for all of the guys that we work with. It's not a small ask to say you can't spend time with anybody. And so balancing the comfort of your family and the needs of your family with the needs of your son, I think, you know, what we've seen in for me personally, my personal life, but also with the guys that we work with, is that every family is managing the pandemic differently, and every client is managing the pandemic differently in terms of their socialization. And so it may not need to be as simple as a blanket yes or no type statement in terms of whether you can or cannot see friends. Maybe it's worth a conversation to sit down with your son and even just go through the friends that are in the area and who is working at the supermarket and who is social distancing and quarantining at home and doing remote school, and are there environments in which maybe there would be more comfort in them seeing specific friends in certain situations, just to have some of those needs be met without saying, you know, sort of there's free reign or nothing. So I think there's certainly room to meet in the middle. And I will also say, you know, we're going into some of these questions later in the hour, but that's going to be different for every son, every young man. You know, that's not going to work with everybody, but there may be dynamics where those types of conversations could be fruitful.
Thanks, Dave and Justin. The next question that we have here is somewhat similar in that it pertains to respecting house rules and reintegrating back into the home. The question that we received was, we are worried that our son will come home and disrupt the rules that we have in place for his siblings and simply ignore them and go on living as if he is still in his dorm or at college. How do we address this worry so that we're not constantly in confrontations and in a way that he understands that is setting an example? So Justin, I just want to give you a chance again to start us off here.
Yeah, this one's tricky. You know, I was hearing you read the question, and I was thinking about what it was like for me to return home, which is probably neither here nor there. But you know, this is a complicated environment right now, I think, especially. But parents have the right to be worried, for sure. They've created an environment where, you know, things were sort of set up the way that they wanted, and then the return home sort of like adds this sort of like grenade effect. What they had was no longer what's going to happen, right? This kid comes in with a different experience, a different way of living, and you know, he might disrupt things. So I think the worry is genuine, But I would just offer that developmentally speaking, it's actually relatively appropriate for those rules to adjust to the development of your emerging adult who's off to college. They have become used to a life wherein they were able to make decisions freely. They had absolute agency, relatively, to make decisions on what time they wake up, how they treat their space, who they interact with little or no sort of input from parents, other than from a distance, likely. So I think to expect that they just acquiesce to what it was like for them maybe in high school is probably misplaced and probably misguided, although I'm certainly recognizing and sensitive to how that stirs up some worry. I think the challenge is to appreciate that it's actually appropriate to change the environment to be more conducive and supportive of the momentum that your young adult has already experienced. I think it's a little bit unfair to expect them to sort of waver and go back and forth when they were off as an adult and then coming back and sort of having to navigate new challenges. Now, that being said, it sounds like it's probably going to need to be a little bit of a difficult conversation, because I'm not suggesting whatsoever that we can entirely acquiesce to them either. Just wanted to sort of, I guess, call attention to the developmentally appropriateness of changing the environment. I think there was a part in there, Nick, around sort of the disruption with respect to the siblings as well. And the only other thing I would add is, obviously, again, you can see how I'm framing this developmentally. So, siblings, depending on where they are in their development and where they are, in terms of what they've been exposed to with the house rules, fair doesn't always mean equal treatment. So you're thinking about a college kid, what's fair to them, given where they're at and given what they've been accustomed to, may have to actually look very different than what fair looks like for kids who have already existed at home or are living at home. And so while that might cause tension, those are the kind of conversations that I would be encouraging be had, right? This doesn't actually have to equal out, but fairness across the board is what we're hoping for. So hopefully, I think that maybe hopefully addresses some things.
Yeah, and just to chime in here, guys, in regards to that, Justin, I do think that your point around, fair and not equal is a great one. I mean, I think in terms of treating each individual in the home as, an individual in the home is really a strong starting point there in that conversation. As we're transitioning to the next question here, guys, I just wanted to address the open forum that we're planning to have in terms of, answering questions at the end. Lisa, I can see that you have your hand raised, and, I would just ask that you hold your question until the end. We'll hopefully be able to respond there, but want to give a chance to sort of work through the questions that everybody sent in. If you'd like to leave your hand raised, though, I'll make sure to come back to you there at the end. So our next question was, as a parent, what is the best way to help a young man when they are trying to figure out what to do next? What strategies best help them to move forward? Dave, I think this would be a great one for you to start with.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really interesting, it's an interesting question just because of, I think it gets at something that is really core to the experience of a lot of the guys that we work with, where it's a really difficult situation for guys when they find themselves in this place, because at least from our experience, it feels abnormal in some way that they're in this position where they're not really sure what to do. And yet, as a young adult, having periods of time where in your life where you experience doubt, where you experience uncertainty regarding what you want to do next, that's so normal, right? It's such a normal experience that everyone has been, that every person has been in at some point in their young adult life. At least I would venture to guess that that's true. And so this idea of not knowing is totally fine. The question that I would ask is, how is your son handling that? Are they engaging in activities that may lead to knowing, or are they sitting at home waiting for clarity to come on its own? There's a quote that we have up on in our office from Angela Duckworth that I'd like to read, and those of you who may or may not be familiar with her, She's a researcher who has pioneered a lot of the research that currently exists around grit. And this is the quote that she says. She says, interests are not discovered through introspection. Instead, interests are triggered by interactions with the outside world. The process of interest discovery can be messy, serendipitous, and inefficient. This is because you can't really predict with certainty what will capture your attention and what won't. Without experimenting, you can't figure out which interests will stick and which won't. And so I think it's really about this quality, right? This quality of moving from introspection to interaction with the outside world and engaging with different activities, areas of study, ideas, people, and seeing what sticks, as she says in the quote. And the other thing I'll add is to be patient with your son as well. Everybody, quote unquote, figures it out at a different pace. And so there's no recipe here of it's going to, give them 6 weeks and then, it's not quite that neat. So, yeah, I think just this idea is really, really important of being patient and engaging in activities that lead to knowing.
Yeah, that quote is great, man. I remember when we were sort of going over that as a staff, I was just something that dawned on me that I would just add, I guess, is this notion of cultivating curiosity as a means by which to get to that sort of playing and experience. There's such a pervasive notion that these guys that we work with need to have figured it out by now. They're surrounded in an environment where the path is relatively linear. I love that kind of concept that you just said. It's like not really like sort of recipe cookie cutters type stuff, but the predominant notion I think these guys that we work with experience is that they should know and that they should have a direction already figured out. And so I think just like sort of breaking that mold, that quote really, I love that quote, cultivating curiosity so that it's okay to not know, and better yet, it's actually okay to play. Like get out there, experience things. Now in the COVID environment, it can be a little bit tricky, but even things like, what do you daydream about, and pay some attention to that stuff. I think by being curious around the world around you, you start to really understand where those interests lie. So that I just wanted to add that because I think that quote's awesome.
Yeah, and I think and just to add a little bit to it as well, I think one of maybe the themes of this conversation tonight is, about promoting, your young adult's autonomy and agency. And so one of the best things that we can always do in doing that is by just simply asking, right? Not trying to figure it out, not trying to take a guess at it. And listen, you guys are parents, so you're always going to be the experts on your children. That said, they're very much in a stage of development. And Justin, to go back to your point, as far as like, developmental stages and what's normative, wherein they're trying to figure out who they are absent of your help. They're trying to figure out who they can be as an individual. And so absent of your help is not entirely true, right? They're going to still have you as resources. But I think just being able to simply ask them, hey, what is it that you need from us?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Andy. And one that, I think I'm even thinking as we're talking about it, just being able to hold the space for the not knowing, right? Of this, as the parent not necessarily needing to provide the answers in the same way that, for us, when we're working with guys, there can sometimes feel pressure to provide an answer, but sometimes it's really just about holding the space for the not knowing and just allowing that to be okay, to be 19 years old, 20 years old, and not know what you want to do, or be on a path that you're not really sure if college is for you in this moment, and to just allow that to be okay, and to as best as possible separate the anxieties that inevitably come as a parent about it's the 21st century and I live in either southwestern Connecticut or another suburb of New York City, and my child is considering not going to college and everything that may mean for them and their future, but trying to separate that from holding the space for them and the not knowing, because that's where they are right now, and the way for them to know is by having the space to work through it.
Yeah, I'd also say just acknowledging the humanity in that experience, right? And just appreciating that it is normal to be uncertain, at that developmental period. So, yeah, appreciate all the insight, guys. Our next question sort of ties in to the question before this around reintegration into the home, but the question was, my son has already come home from school and has had a lot of trouble reintegrating into our house ecosystem. He has been up all night talking with friends while we were trying to sleep, and has even decided it was okay to quote unquote light up in the house because his friends were doing it. How the heck can we get on the same page with a kid that feels that he is always right and that we are going crazy, overly conservative parents? It feels that like 3 to 4 months ago, we were in this position and that we're here all over again. Justin, would you care to chime in here?
Yeah, and Andy, you and I were talking offline about this one a little bit, but yeah, so going back to my earlier statement, right, I was sort of suggesting that we appreciate the developmentally normal of stage, and we sort of meet with them where they're at and create an environment that meets them and that momentum of agency. So there's a couple pieces to this question. I'll take, I guess, the easier one, and Andy, I'll get to have you take the harder one. But for me, I think the easier one is sort of the expectation set around like the video games and the staying up late and the reintegration and conflict associated with that time spent. Look, I mean, the reality is, again, going back to how I think we conceptualize what they've been accustomed to, the reality is your emerging adult son or daughter was accustomed to a way of life where that was just normative. And so it's almost square pegging a round hole to suggest that they need to, go to bed at a certain time per se, right? I mean, obviously within reason, we're not looking for 4 a.m., bedtimes, but they have a way of living that's just not going to be something that I think you were accustomed to prior. And so things like video games or staying up a little bit later would be conversations to be had, but conversations that sort of appreciate and recognize your son or daughter's independence, and as part of that process, that they have agency in their decision making, that it certainly impacts you guys at the house. But to the degree that they're needing to actually change that behavior, I would just, I guess, challenge whether or not that's something that as parents we can become more accustomed to, that being actually a sign of developmentally appropriate stuff versus not. Now, the lighting up part though, Andy, I don't know. You could talk about that.
Yeah, so I think, thanks, Justin, and agree with everything you said. And one of the things that I think is also important, right, is, it's it's also your right to have boundaries regarding what goes on or is allowed inside of your home, especially as it pertains to illegal substances. Justin, great quote earlier, just kind of talking about, equal treatment and fair treatment not necessarily being synonymous. And what your son's friends' parents allow in their home is their business, and not you or your son's concern. So it's really up to you guys to set whatever boundaries you're comfortable with setting. And the reality is if he wants to smoke, for instance, he's going to find a way to continue smoking if he's inclined. That doesn't mean you have to be okay with it having it in the house. And that also means that, there's sort of a respect factor that comes into reestablishing, those clear house rules and boundaries, understanding what's within reason, but wanting to do so in a way that establishes, mutual respect, again, for your son's autonomy. Safety obviously should always remain the top priority. So, it's not encouraging your son to go smoke and drive around in his car or anything of that nature. But I think, there's probably a middle ground that can be found. I think, it's equally difficult for you guys all is the reality. Is just as hard as it is for you guys. It's just as hard for him because he's so used to a college lifestyle. He's so used to kind of being out on his own. And that's not me endorsing any of that behavior at all. But I think really just wanting to make sure that the most important thing you guys can do is incorporate a compromise that allows you all to have your individual needs met, which, it can be tricky, but it's certainly possible.
Yeah, and just hearing that too, before we move on, Nick, I guess the one thing that just really dawns on me, Andy, that I think you and I have experienced in some of the work is and I like how you were framing it, the relational component, I think is super important, right? This mutual respect, I think, is the language you use. I think it's super critical. Oftentimes, I was hearing in that question, Nick, some like contention. I think contention sometimes breeds transaction, right? So like just rules and contracts and like, you got to stop smoking weed and you got to play stop playing video games. And it's sort of very dry and black and white. And I think clarity is super important, but contextualizing oftentimes how the message is said is far more important than what the message actually is. I think that plays off a little bit what I was hearing, Andy, with, you know, how you approach your son in a way that sort of respects that agency and actually just communicates respect enough to treat him as an adult as a part of that conversation.
Appreciate that, guys. The next question we have is, my 20-year-old son is terrified of growing up. He's barely making it in college and can't seem to even find an entry-level job. How can we help him get past whatever is hanging him up about getting ready to be an adult? And I think this question really underpins, you know, a lot of what we see at Causeway, and, you know, sort of is a theme amongst all of our clients to some extent. So, Andy, if you're all right with it, I'm going to kick this one over to you to start.
Yeah, sure. And I would agree, you know, and I think first and foremost, one of the things that where I would kind of jump to first is trying to understand how he's actually perceiving the world around him, and what it is that actually feels so threatening to him to begin with. You know, that said, he might not even be aware of it himself, which can make that conversation tricky. And, you know, oftentimes when we see guys who fit that type of archetype, it's never actually really about school or the job. And in fact, like, those symptoms likely permeate into a lot of other aspects of his life, because, you know, oftentimes those types of behaviors are less about capability and more about an internal struggle. You know, there's a pretty high likelihood that a guy who's presenting in that way is not just struggling with some anxiety, but also issues of self-worth, feeling and you know, for those guys, unfortunately, what ends up happening is the question kind of shifts from what can I do, or what am I capable of, you know, what's my ceiling, to kind of like, what's the point? And that can be fairly damaging in a lot of ways. And so I think the first step is really understanding and helping him to understand those underlying symptoms, and two ways, you know, in which you can do that. I think first, a process where he can begin to unpack all of those things, and second, a process where he can actively work to, you know, build himself back up. I think oftentimes those guys that are dealing with that, and Nick, you said it perfectly. We see these kind of things all the time. We see these guys who have such potential and such capacity that are just floundering in a lot of ways. And so after so long of that floundering, again, you kind of see a lot of these symptoms that start to come up, where, you know, guys shift from, you know, having a sense of actual control over their world to feeling like victims of their environment. Oftentimes you have a guys who feel that they're just, you know, they used to be so capable, they're not living up to the expectation. And so what ends up happening is more times than not, what these guys tend to need are to build on wins. They need to build on self-efficacy, which I think self-efficacy, self-esteem, self-worth, all fairly similar concepts. But I think where self-efficacy actually goes above and beyond those things is it's a feeling of self-worth based on a sort of concrete idea and belief in one's capabilities that's kind of proven to themselves. So being able to rack up some of those small wins, being able to kind of scale things down. You know, clients come to mind who, you know, I have clients who have 35s on their ACTs, and they can't take 2 classes at NCC. And it's not because they're not intelligent enough or because they're not capable enough, but it's very much wanting to understand a symptom set that is in the way. And when those symptoms are in the way, you're not going to see a guy actually reaching their potential, or acting in a way that would kind of bring them to sort of like their fullest version of themselves. And so one of the things that we have to kind of do sometimes, unfortunately, is sort of deconstruct that, scale it down, build success, let the guy understand and feel, again, kind of going back to some of that experiential stuff, Justin, Dave, Nick, you guys all kind of touched on this a little bit before, but the need to experience concrete wins and build from there, no matter how small. And making that scalable is just so important for guys like this, because, again, at the end of the day, I don't truly believe, 99% of the time, I should say, I don't believe it's a capability problem more so than it is a symptom issue.
Yeah, Andy, as I'm hearing you talk about that, the smaller wins, scaling it down, identifying through conversation with your son, just ways for him to build purpose and mastery, or experience sort of mastery in overcoming those challenges and experiencing those small wins, you know, I think is in addition to what you're speaking to, a really nice piece there. Eric, I saw you posed a question. I just want to remind everybody that we're going to come back to Q&A around probably 7:45. But if you guys can just hold your questions till the end, I'll make sure to answer. So, apologize. Our next question is one that we get often asked, and it's around sort of discussing setting financial limits and how to transition from being dependent to financially independent, which is obviously different and varies based on circumstance, comfortability. But Dave, I think you've fielded this question quite a few times in your work, and just want to give you an opportunity to speak to that a little bit. So,
sure, yeah, and I'm aware as we're answering these questions, we're really not giving a lot of instruction, and that may be disappointing if you've asked these questions and you're looking for that. But I just want to recognize that there's no one size fits all sort of solution to a lot of these things. There's not, and how do you work towards financial independence? Well, you do this, 2 weeks in, then this 2 weeks later. It just doesn't quite work that way. And so, at least in terms of how we think about it, and in terms of how we work with the guys that come through Causeway. But I think in terms of the underlying sort of philosophy around this, from my perspective, it's really about orienting this process through the best interests of the young man that we're working with, or in this case, your son. A lot of the time, these financial limits and transitions to independence can feel like punishments when they're really vehicles to self-actualization and independence. And so the most frequently, I guess when we see this process work successfully, it's often the young man is able to get on board with this being something that would be good for him to do. And so if there's a way to work towards that and to get them to buy into financial independence and limits as, it's something that they can say, like, yeah, that would be a good thing for me to have. And that often helps a lot. And in that same vein, at Causeway, we have a belief that every young man we work with wants that in some measure. That no person wants to be reliant on their parents for their whole life. And so there's this underlying belief that the guys we're working with want that, and it's just about helping them tap into that and use that. And so now I'll get into a little bit of like practical elements here, tangible elements, but some places to start if you're struggling to find an entry point to start to chip away at financial dependence and limits and things like that, might be expenses that may seem excessive or luxurious or unreasonable, or use whatever word fits for you. Common culprits there could be video games, could be other forms of entertainment, could be clothing, could be eating out. All of these types of things, setting limits around what you're willing to cover, and then making it clear that the rest needs to be sort of self-funded. So it's not that they can't eat out every night or every day, twice a day, or whatever the habit is, or spend hundreds of dollars a month on video games, but that money needs to come from their own source of income. And so that can just be a way to start to develop an appreciation for how much hobbies cost, or how much eating out costs relative to the food that's in the fridge, or just going grocery shopping. And so some of these basic sort of connections often are lacking, we find. And so helping guys to make that connection just by setting some of those ground rules. And then the other thing that I just wanted to mention is I think it's really important to stick to whatever the rules are that get set. So far too often we'll either see or hear about a family that may set an expectation around a budget, and then when the young man exceeds it, the parents end up covering it. And so that is really, really important to avoid as best as possible, to have language we use a lot as natural consequences for decisions and for actions. And so, if something is unable to be paid for, or, if the money goes into an account and when the account gets overdrawn, there's penalties that, any normal human being experiences if they overdraw an account, those are learning opportunities for the young men that we work with. And we really encourage not sort of bailing them out in those instances and inadvertently reinforcing the patterns that you're trying to help them break. So those are just a couple of different elements there that I think may be helpful when talking about this transition to financial independence.
Well said, Dave. So I think we have time for probably one more question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But the last question that I think we're going to address tonight is one that came through around balance. The question is, how do we balance letting go versus helping him learn how to live on his own? Which I think is a large philosophical question in terms of your approach, but a good one nonetheless. Justin, I'll let you start off with this, and hopefully we'll all have an opportunity to chime in here.
Yeah, I'd love to get your guys' thoughts across this one, because this one's, I feel this one for sure. This is one that I think is tricky. I think it's very personal in some ways, highly individualized around when those experiences occur. And it's across time, right? There's not this culminating moment. There's all these times to let go and times to teach. And so it can be tricky. Rather than sort of the advice piece, I would maybe ask yourself some questions to start. From an internalized process, Andy, you talked a little bit about this sort of from an external or internal focus. I think oftentimes in the work that we do, we try to redirect the attention back towards an internal focus. And so maybe as a parent, asking yourself why it's hard to let go is a place to start. And sort of a subsequent question would be, is there something about your childhood and how it is that you were raised, or something that you experienced as a part of raising and bringing up your children that you're struggling through? Sometimes those are where the answers are a little bit, is, our own personal experiences often inform how it is that we're then leaning on those experiences to teach others. And so once you have a better understanding of where that stuff's coming for you internally, I think the suggestion and or quote unquote advice would be to start to compartmentalize the importance of, you processing your desires as a parent for what this emerging adult needs to experience, and what they need to genuinely experience as a sort of a separate self. Those two different situations, two different selves, need a chance to allow for that detachment to occur healthily. So the letting go aspect is almost an internally focused process. I think to start is appreciating, what is the desire to keep this kid under your wing, and is that actually getting us to where we eventually want, kids to go, which is, being happy, healthy, individualized adults. And sometimes it does. I mean, Dave, you were just talking about this a little bit with suffering, but sometimes it's challenging to be on the sidelines and really watch and make some pretty silly errors. But I mean, we all went through that as part of our development. I think it's really critical that they do the same.
Yeah, I think just to add to that a little bit too, there's that famous quote, a parent's job is never done. And if I can add to the back of that, maybe, right, I would maybe challenge that a little bit in saying, like, a parent's job is never done, but the job description changes. And I think, again, we've talked a lot about like normative developmental tasks. We've talked a lot about like how the relationship shifts, how all of those things kind of change. And I think as the children grow older and as they do move into that period of late adolescence, early adulthood, where they're trying to sort of become independent, I think one of the things that we can do in sort of respecting that is actually allowing them to fail. And that can be incredibly, incredibly uncomfortable. And also, it's one of the best ways in which your child is ever going to learn. If we are, there's kind of some feedback I've provided to parents in the past before who get too involved at times is some situations you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? If you're so eager to give your child the answer, even if you think it's true, even if it is the 100% correct answer, what you're doing is ultimately taking away from their ability to build again on those feelings of self-efficacy. Yes, I accomplished this, but I only did it because I was guided and I was told how to do it, or I was helped very much. And so one of the best things we can do, I think, as parents is ultimately letting our kids figure these things out, through trials and tribulations. And of course, again, you don't want to, there's a comfort level and again, a boundary that you have to place on yourself as far as how much you are willing to allow your kid to fail versus, how much you need to kind of like come and pick them up and help them float along. But if you give them advice and they take it and it ends up poor for them, well, they're only going to have you to blame. And if you give them advice and they take it and it all works out, well, then they only have you to give the credit to. And so I think it's a really, really tricky balance to figure out.
Well said, Andy. Catherine, thank you for the kind words there. We just saw that come through. Guys, want to open it up for sort of a Q&A here. If you would be so kind to just write your questions into the Q&A chat, I'll get to them, sequentially. But Eric, yours is the first. How has your school and career planning approach changed when dealing with someone with high anxiety? How do you approach helping practice interactions with others while dealing with the pandemic? Eric, really good question. Andy, I think you've had some unique experiences, around doing some of that work with, highly anxious clients, even exposure work to some extent. So probably.
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, so, one of the things and with a lot of clients that I work with who are dealing with extreme, issues of anxiety, extreme symptoms of anxiety, one of the first things that I like to provide guys with is sort of like a psychoeducational piece. And so one of the things that I think is important to understand about mental health is that it's not only mental. There's very much a biological basis of behavior. There's very much sort of a physiological symptom set that comes along with a lot of these ailments, especially anxiety. And so one of the things specifically with anxiety that I like to educate people on is that anxiety actually triggers a mechanism in your brain that shuts down our highest level of thinking function of our brain. So our prefrontal cortex is very much what separates us, what makes us human, what gives us the ability to be logical and rational and sort of think at a higher level. Even the idea of metacognition, our ability to think about thinking, right, is very much a prefrontal cortex function. When anxiety is triggered in the brain, you're triggering a part of your brain called the amygdala, which activates a defense mechanism. And so physiologically, mentally, cognitively, what happens to you basically when that mechanism is triggered is you enter more of like a fight, flight, or freeze response. And it's, scientifically impossible for you to actually be rational and forward thinking while you're in that sort of like state of fight, flight, or freeze. And so one of the things that I think is really, really, again, important to understand about anxiety, especially when you're dealing with kind of like things such as like academic planning, career planning, things like that, the academic and career planning couldn't be further from the capabilities of an individual who is actively dealing with high levels of anxiety. So that said, I think first and foremost, what you have to do is you have to treat the symptoms as they stand. You have to meet, your kid, our client, where they're at. We have to treat the anxiety and we have to get them to a baseline level where we can turn off that fight, flight, or freeze response and give them an opportunity to reactivate some of those prefrontal cortex functions so that they can then actually begin to even start thinking about that stuff. Because if we don't do that, we're just going to actually add to the anxiety levels and we're just going to actually perpetuate a cycle of anxiety and disappointment.
Yeah, Andy, I'll jump off of that. I don't have any science to add, but I think I'll add my perspectives from the school side, because school and career planning for young adults is often so much in the forefront of everybody's mind and priorities. And telling somebody, a parent, a young man, anybody, you're going to have to put school on hold until we figure this out, that can be really, really tough. That can be a really, really tough sell. that can be really tough to hear. And a lot of the time, families that we work with don't want that. That's not the answer they're looking for. They want to find a way to do everything, to keep going with school, to keep going with a career plan, and to manage the anxiety or find ways to do it. And so, I think it's important to think about maybe decreasing workload academically. Maybe a guy we're working with, maybe they don't need to stop going to school altogether, but maybe they take 2 classes, or maybe they come home and they do school from home and go to community college and figure out how to transfer the credits, or something along those lines. But so it's not necessarily that you need to put school on hold. And I just want to appreciate how difficult that can be sometimes to agree to. And we've seen both. We've seen guys who have found real benefit to continuing to chip away at a future for themselves, or a path towards completing something they've been working really hard towards. And we've seen guys who have found tremendous benefit to taking a semester off and to really addressing what they're working on really, really clearly and very directly. And so, again, I think, Andy, like you were talking about, the evaluation of what's really going on and what's needed is really important. So it's not that, and the recommendation changes based on that, right? So it's not that a young man we're working with, if he is experiencing high anxiety, can't go to school or can't work, and it's not that he needs to. It really depends on what his specific manifestation of anxiety looks like and how it's affecting him, and also what his ability to be successful is. I think one of the things that we also see a lot is guys who try and push through a significant mental health deficit, who end up failing classes and putting themselves back and experiencing a really significant failure that is almost completely a manifestation of a mental health presentation or presenting concern, rather than, as you guys were talking about before, like, it's not a capacity issue. It's not a question of whether they can do it when everything is working the right way. And so, we talked about failing being a part of life, and on the academic side, it can be challenging to experience that and feel that setback in a different way. So just wanted to chime in on that.
Really well said, Dave. Guys, as we're wrapping up here, just want to offer a space for any follow-up questions, any other questions that you guys might have. Feel free to throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to them. Other than that, that somewhat concludes our presentation for this evening. And again, really, really appreciate you guys. We'll hang here for the remainder of the hour, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. Vanessa, you're welcome. And we just also received the question around whether or not this recording will become available. We are going to make this available on our website under the resources for families and for young men. So if you guys want to come back and share this with your family, with friends, you'll be able to access this recording through our website.
And we can actually even send an email out to everybody who attended to let you know that recording is up, so that you're not needing to check daily or anything along those lines. Not sure exactly what the timeline will be, but we can definitely let you guys know.
Eric, I just wanted to respond to your last point there. Definitely a challenging situation, but a lot of credit to you for trying to support him through this challenging time, and we're glad that we were able to offer some helpful insights. Catherine just asked a question, can we offer a webinar for spring when kids aren't going back to school? It's probably something that we're going to have to discuss as a team, but we'd be happy to inform you guys of any upcoming events that we decide to put on. And Catherine, I think that could be a really, really great idea. So thank you for bringing that up. Lisa, happy Thanksgiving to you as well. Trisha, thank you. Thank you very much. You have a happy Thanksgiving as well. All right, everybody. So we're going to wrap up here. Again, thank you so much for making the time to be with us tonight. I hope that some of what we were able to share with you was helpful, and that you could take some of these insights, into the holidays with you. For families that we've worked with in the past, thank you for making yourselves available, and it was great to be able to touch base in this way and feel connected. We wish you guys the best, and happy holidays to all of you.